Okay, hello everybody. My name's Al, and today I'm going to be talking about how to replace your old motherboard with a brand new motherboard in your computer. And before we get going, I just want to apologize. I have been feeling a little bit sick lately, so if you hear me coughing or if, my voice is a little hoarse or anything like that, sorry for that. But it was about time I went ahead and got this recording made. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Now, like I said, we're going to be replacing a motherboard in an otherwise functioning PC, so I'm going to assume that you want to keep all of the current components in your computer and only replace the motherboard. So with that in mind, it's extremely important to make sure that all the other parts in your computer are compatible with your new motherboard. So you want to make sure that you have the correct form factor for your motherboard so that it fits in the case and that it can be mounted properly inside your computer. And it's also important that your CPU, your memory, your GPU are all compatible with your motherboard. Those are really some of the big ones that you want to look out for. If you have parts that don't work together properly, your computer might not turn on at all, or it might run really, really poorly if you do manage to get it to turn on. So that's not something that any of us want. And finally, you should also keep in mind that the needs of your power supply could change a little bit with a new motherboard. So you just want to double check that your power supply is going to provide enough power for all of your parts and also not cause any damage to your system. Now, a great place to check out compatibility of components is PCPartPicker.com. I have a feeling that you're probably a little bit familiar with this already. It's a great resource for verifying your system components are compatible. So you can start by selecting your motherboard, then adding each other part one at a time, and the site will give you a pretty good idea of letting you know if those parts are going to work together. But it's not perfect. So you should also keep in mind that checking the manufacturer's website or other resources on the internet is a really good idea just to double check that those parts will in fact work together. Now, if everything goes well and our parts are going to work, then we need to make sure that we have all the tools handy before we get started. And there's actually not that much that you need to swap out your motherboard. In most cases, a standard Phillips head screwdriver should work. There could be some different screw types depending on your case or the boards inside your case, but generally speaking, a Phillips head screwdriver works more often than not, and you can always double check what your case has to make sure you get the right kind. You're also going to make sure that you get an anti-static wrist strap for preventing static electricity from building up and discharging through your hands. That could potentially damage some of your computer parts. You also want to have some thermal paste handy to apply to your CPU later when you install it on the new motherboard. But that's pretty much it. Now, before we get to work removing the old motherboard, first things first, let's kill the power. You've probably heard this 100 times by now, but you want to make sure you shut down the computer completely. You want to unplug those power cables. You want to flip off your PSU switch that's usually found in the back, wherever your power unit is, if you have one. And you want to make sure that you hold down the power button on the front of your case or the main power button for a good 10 to 20 seconds to fully discharge any remaining electricity in the system. At this point, you also want to make sure that you remove any peripheral devices like your mouse, your keyboard, your monitor, Ethernet cables, and really anything else plugged into any of these external ports before you get to work. Okay, next we'll open up the computer case. Now each case is a little bit different, so check for any external screws that you might need to loosen and remove with your screwdriver. Some may be easy enough to loosen with your fingers and you can just take them out that way, otherwise use that screwdriver. And after that, you should be able to slide the cover off of the case and set it aside. At this point, it can be helpful to take a few pictures or draw a diagram to help you keep track of how each part is laid out, either if you have to reinstall the current components back how they were, or just to help you understand the best way to put your components back together with that new motherboard. Now, before you actually touch anything inside the computer, it's very important to make sure you put on that anti-static wrist guard. You're going to wrap the cuff around your wrist, then attach the clip to a metal part of your case before touching any of the internal components. You can also discharge any static electricity that might have built up by touching your hand to the metal part of your case or some other piece of metal nearby, just to make sure you don't accidentally fry any of those components as soon as you touch them. Next, we're going to set about actually removing those components that are attached to your motherboard, and we're going to go ahead and start with the GPU first. Now, unhook the power cable that's running to the GPU from the motherboard, and then remove any screws that attach the card to the case. These should be at the back of the computer near the external ports. Once the power cord and screws are removed, check the PCI slot for a tab that holds the card in place. Usually there's at least one on the end of that PCIe card, so press that down until it opens up, then gently pull the GPU expansion card away from the PCIe slot on the motherboard, and be careful not to wiggle it too much. You can damage the pins or even the slot itself. Don't wiggle around too much because that could cause all kinds of problems for you later. Next thing we're going to do is remove the DIMM modules, your memory cards, from their PCI slots. So make sure that you press on the tabs just like you did on that GPU and pull those cards out very gently. Again, do not wiggle them side to side on the short edge. You can wiggle them end to end lengthwise a little bit if you need to, but try not to do that, again, because you don't want to damage those cards. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove the cooler above the CPU. In most cases, it's going to be attached directly to the motherboard with screws. So you can unplug the CPU power connector from the motherboard first, go ahead and loosen those screws, then lift the cooler up and off of the CPU. You're going to see there's most likely going to be some old thermal paste on the bottom of that GPU. You can wipe that off with a probably clean paper towel would be fine. And we're going to add more to it later. It's usually good practice to make sure that's nice and clean and has fresh paste whenever you're going to take that off and swap it. Now, you should also remove every other connector running to the motherboard at this time. That includes headers for the fans, the front panel, audio headers, USB connections, your M2 or your SATA power and data cables that might be coming from your disk drives, and especially the 24-pin power cord running to the motherboard from the power supply unit. The fans can sometimes be in the way, so you might want to go ahead and take those out as well. Usually they're attached to your case with a couple of screws. Unscrew those, set them aside somewhere where you won't lose them, and get that fan out of the way if you need to make sure that you have room to work. Now, once all the cords and cards are removed from the motherboard, use your screwdriver to remove the screws holding the motherboard to the case itself. Again, set those aside somewhere you won't lose them. Don't want to lose any of these little pieces, especially if you need to reuse them to reattach some of these components. Also easy to overlook, but very important to remember, is that there's probably going to be an I/O shield on the back of your case. Go ahead and pop that off now too. In some cases, it is attached to the motherboard and you won't really have to worry about it though. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and remove the CPU from its socket on the old motherboard. We're going to assume that you're going to keep that CPU and you want to keep using it with your new motherboard. I'm sure you remembered to make sure that your CPU is compatible with the socket and new motherboard. What you need to do is go ahead and unfasten the spring arm that's attached to the CPU. It's usually going to be on one side. You can kind of push that down and out to the side. Then you can push that arm backwards and it's going to allow you to lift up the socket cover that's holding the CPU in place. So go ahead, push that back, take the CPU out, and be very, very careful. Those pins on the bottom of the CPU are very fragile. On your CPU that you just removed from that old board, usually there's some notches or there's some markings in the corner. That's going to let you know how to properly align that CPU in its new socket. So look for matching notches or markings on your new CPU socket to tell you how to properly align that CPU. Gently place that CPU into the brand new socket. Doesn't need very much force at all. Again, those sensitive pins are easy to damage, so you want to gingerly place it down there, matching the notches and the markings inside the socket. Now, one quick thing I didn't mention before on the last slide, generally speaking, want to clean off your old thermal paste from that CPU. A clean paper towel is usually more than enough to do this. Wipe that old thermal paste off, either right after you install it or right before you install it in this new socket. And next, we're going to go ahead and install your DIMM modules. One important thing to remember is that different DIMM modules, depending on how much you have, the manufacturer, and a few other things, they need to be arranged in very specific ways. This is also going to depend on the number of PCIe slots that you have on that brand new motherboard. So make sure you look up the proper way to install these sticks, because if you put them in the wrong order, it's either going to go really slow or it might not even be able to boot up your computer at all. And generally speaking, if you look up the manufacturer, it should be pretty easy to find out the best way to install those on to your new motherboard. Once you know the best way to put them in, just go ahead and insert them gently right down into those PCI slots, top down, straight ahead. Again, you do not want to wiggle them very much at all because you can damage those pins. And usually when you push them in, you'll hear a little click as those tabs on the end kind of snap into place to hold your DIMM modules where they're supposed to be. So once you know that those are securely fastened in place, you can go ahead and move on to the next step. And we're going to talk about that I/O shield again really quick. Go ahead and put that in the back now. It's going to be handy to use as a guide for installing the motherboard later on. So you want to make sure that you install it before you put the motherboard itself into the case. And generally speaking, you can just press this into the opening on the back of your computer. A lot of them don't have any kind of screws or any other special way to fasten them. You just kind of have to cram it in there and then make sure that it's sitting flush with the rest of the case. And after the shield is installed, we're ready to insert the motherboard itself. Now, before you install the board, it's crucial you make sure spacers are installed over the screw holes that will be used to fasten the board to the case. The spacers rest between the motherboard and the wall of the case, so make sure the board does not touch the metal case at all, it can short out. That's what those spacers do for you. They have built-in screw holes, so you can kind of screw them into the case itself, and then there's also an opening for the screws that attach to the motherboard to go through the motherboard and into those spacers to hold the motherboard into place. Absolutely crucial that you make sure there's spacers everywhere that you're going to be screwing screws into the motherboard itself. Position your motherboard inside the case. That I/O shield I mentioned earlier can be really handy for making sure that you have the ports lined up in the right spot from there. Then you want to make sure you snug those screws into place, get them firmly tightened, but you do not want to over tighten them. You can crack the motherboard or cause damage by tightening them too much. So now we're going to go ahead and install our CPU cooler. I alluded to it earlier, but we are going to apply some new thermal paste, so you can go ahead and squirt a nice dollop onto the center of your CPU. You don't really need to spread it out at all. As you apply your CPU cooler on top of it, it should kind of smush that paste into position. So apply your thermal paste, then line up the screws attached to the CPU cooler and tighten those screws in. I like to kind of go around and tighten them partway first until I know they're all partially threaded, and then I'll go through and finish tightening them up. Again, firmly, but not overly tight. Okay, now it's a good time to reattach all of those other sort of peripheral data connections, your SATA cables, the M2 cables from your disk drives, the USB audio front panel and fan headers, all of those other cables that came from different parts of your computer and were attached to the motherboard that you removed earlier. It can be really helpful to look for labeling and diagrams on your motherboard to make sure you know where these cables are supposed to go. They may not necessarily be in the same place as on your old motherboard. You should also make sure to attach that 24-pin connector coming from the power supply unit and the CPU power cable as well before we move on to the next step, which is going to be installing the GPU. Let's go ahead and install that GPU. Insert the GPU into the first PCI 16 card slot on the motherboard. That's usually going to be the best place to do it. Gently press the GPU card into that slot and make sure the tab on the end of the PCI slot snaps shut to hold the GPU into place. You also want to make sure that you reinsert the screw on the end of the GPU towards the back of the case typically. That's also going to help give support, prevent the GPU from shaking around if you bump your computer, possibly falling out, all of that kind of good stuff. Once you have the GPU in place, reattach the 6 or 8 pin power cable to the graphics card to make sure it's getting power to properly run. And finally, before we do anything else, we're just going to double check all of the cables, all of the cards, make sure they're properly connected before you remove your anti-static clip. It's a little bit safer to close the case before you start it up. Some people leave it open. I'll leave that up to you. Then you're going to go ahead and reestablish power to the computer by plugging the PSU cable into its port on the back and an electrical outlet. You want to toggle that PSU power switch back on if there is one. Plug in a monitor, make sure you can see what your new motherboard is telling you, and also plug in any other peripherals like your keyboard and mouse if you're going to need it, which you probably will. Then you're ready to go. So go ahead and press that power button on the machine, and if everything goes well, your computer will boot up, at which point you might have to install a new operating system or run through some other setup processes. We won't really go through that too much here, but we will cover briefly what to do if it doesn't boot up correctly. So you might have to do a little bit of troubleshooting if your computer doesn't start. One of the most helpful things to check is the LED lights on the motherboard itself. Most new motherboards will have these LED lights, and they will give you an idea of what stage it got to in the boot process before it ran into a problem. So check those LED lights. That will give you a really big clue if something's not working correctly. And more often than not, the best way to fix that is to simply shut the computer down again, go through the entire process of discharging the power, unplugging all the power cables, and then reseat those components. Take them out, put them right back in again, make sure that they're correctly seated. It's also possible that you damage them, or it might be that they were never actually compatible with this board in the first place, in which case you have to look at alternate options, possibly even going back to your motherboard if you're going to need your computer in the short-term future. One other thing you can quickly check is the BIOS. If it does start to boot up, or the UEFI will give you a lot of helpful information about the state of your system after you do this motherboard swap. And that's basically it. That's the basics of swapping your old motherboard for a new one. There are a few small areas that we could go into greater detail on, but this is a fairly general overview on what the process looks like, and I didn't want to talk about every possible scenario, especially with my voice going more and more as I go through this process. So thank you very much. Again, my name's Al, and have a good one.